Well, hello, confirmands. This is year 3, lesson 3. We're tying up loose ends today. We're talking about the ascension of Jesus and the day of Pentecost. 7th graders, there's parts of the Jesus story that you probably don't remember. The 8th and the 9th graders, we just did the Jesus year. You'll get to that in your 3rd year, but we ended the Jesus year with Jesus' death, and that's not any place to end that story. We have to pick up with his resurrection, with his ascension into heaven. So you'll be on board with that part, and then after this we go right into the small catechism, and we have Jesus ascended into heaven at the right hand of the Father, and then we have to figure out what that means for us, how we're supposed to live, what we're supposed to believe, and that's what we'll be doing for the rest of this year. So the first 3 words in the phrase that pays this week: you should point. You should point. All right, so Jesus was executed and he was buried in a tomb. He was wrapped in linen strips, impregnated with spices, and he was laid in this tomb. And 3 days later, the tomb was empty. Now, that no one disputes that, right? That there were a whole lot of people who would have loved to have produced Jesus' body, especially when the disciples began saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. A whole lot of his enemies would have loved to have produced Jesus' body and said, no, he hasn't. He's right here, and shown the moldering corpse of Jesus to the whole world to put a lie to what the disciples were saying. The Romans would have loved to have done that. The Jewish authorities would have loved to have done that. This Christian witness that Jesus had risen from the dead, it began to split synagogues. It began to split Jewish families. It split Judaism right down the center, that people on one side of families and synagogues and society said Jesus is not the Messiah. He's nothing. He was killed and he's gone, and good riddance. And on the other side, there were people who said Jesus has risen from the dead. That whole fight could have been settled if someone could have produced Jesus' body, right? Society could have been normalized, families could have been reunited, synagogues could have been reunited, but the tomb was empty. The question that we have to answer and grapple with is, why was the tomb empty? So there have been some different suggestions over the years, and let's just talk about those, right? That sometimes people say, well, the disciples and the women went to the wrong tomb. I'm sorry, that's just silly, right? That the people who buried Jesus knew where they buried him. The Roman government put a guard on the tomb. It was marked and sealed with Pilate's own seal. That we know which tomb Jesus was put in, and we know which tomb was guarded, and we know which tomb was empty. If it was the wrong tomb, again, very shortly people would have said, oh, well, it was the wrong tomb. This one over here, they would have cracked it open, they would have found Jesus' body, and again, all the troubles would have been gone. So that's just a silly thing to say, that this whole kerfluffle was about the wrong tomb. So the big explanation that's given why Jesus' tomb was empty isn't that he rose from the dead, which is what we believe. We believe he rose from the dead. Don't misunderstand. But people who want to argue with that say, well, yeah, the tomb was empty, but it was empty because someone stole the body. Dead people don't rise. To which we say, we know that. We know that dead people don't rise, except this time. But the folks who want to talk about someone stole the body, you have to ask them the question, well, who? Who stole the body? And you'll get one of 4 answers usually. Again, you should be printing my lecture notes so that you can follow along and see if you have questions about any of these. Sometimes people say grave robbers stole the body. Okay, so let's just review. These would have to be the stupidest, most inept grave robbers in the history of the world, right? Because they picked the one tomb that was guarded by Roman soldiers to rob. That seems unlikely to me, right? And then they broke into that tomb, they moved the big stone, they broke into that tomb, and they stole the only thing that didn't have value, the dead body. They didn't steal the linen cloth, and they didn't steal the 100 pounds of spices, some of which could have still been saved and used for other purposes, right? That the corruption of the dead body hadn't seeped into them yet. So you have to believe that these were unbelievably brave, unbelievably stupid, and unbelievably inept grave robbers who broke into a tomb, left everything that had any value, and stole a corpse. It's craziness. It's craziness. Other people say that the Romans stole the body. Why? Why would the Romans steal the body? I mean, even if they did it to tweak the noses of the Jewish authorities, they would have very quickly produced it, because the resurrection of Jesus caused such unrest in this part of the world. Romans didn't like anything that caused unrest. They liked nice, peaceful, orderly commerce, people paying their taxes, people doing what they're supposed to do. There is no reason for the Romans to break their own guard and steal the body of someone who had said, who had been executed as a threat to Caesar, as a threat to Caesar's emperorship. It makes no sense at all. The Romans wanted Jesus dead. They wanted anyone who was a threat to order and stability dead. Some people say the Jewish authorities stole the body. That makes even less sense. The Jewish authorities wanted Jesus dead. They didn't want him to be raised. They certainly didn't want their society to be torn apart. Again, they would have been first in line. If they'd had Jesus' body, if they'd stolen it and buried it somewhere else, they would have been first in line to go get it, bring it out, and say, look, you guys are crazy. He didn't rise from the dead. Here's his body. But they didn't. So they didn't have it, right? And then there's the largest group of people who say, well, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. The disciples stole the body. That's why there's the empty tomb. And then the disciples lied about it so that they'd be, important. We followed someone who was so cool, he even rose from the dead. Now, that at least makes a little bit of sense, right? That the disciples took Jesus' body, they buried it out in the desert someplace, and then they pretended that he had risen from the dead so that they could be important. But let's think about that, right? So you got these 12 guys, right? Judas is gone, Matthias is replaced. Maybe Matthias is in on the lie, maybe he's not. So at least 11 guys who know that this is a lie and that they're telling lies. How committed do you think they would be to that lie for their whole lives? I want you to imagine that you and 10 friends have a lie that you are going to tell so that you feel more important. Okay? Very quickly, you start to be in trouble because of this lie. One of the 11 is killed by the king. Are the other 10 going to stick with the lie? One by one, you guys get imprisoned, beaten, stoned, whipped, flogged, executed. Are you going to stick with the lie? Are all of you going to stick with the lie? Or is someone going to break? How many years do you think all of you could stick with the lie? Right? When we get to the execution of Peter, right? Peter was crucified upside down. They led him out to crucify him, and he said, I'm not worthy to die like Jesus. And they crucified him upside down. It took him days to die, hanging naked in the sun. All he would have had to say was, it was a lie. Jesus didn't rise. We stole his body and buried it in the sand outside the city. Right? They would have taken him down. Do you think you would hang in the sun naked, dying for days and not tell the truth? These 11 guys said for 40 years, being beaten and flogged and imprisoned and executed, that Jesus had risen from the dead and that they'd seen him. It's impossible to me to believe that they lied about that. So we have the empty tomb. That's what we have. And we have the witness of these disciples who say that they saw Jesus alive. And so we believe, as unlikely as it is, and it is unlikely, right? We know people don't get up after they're dead. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That every other explanation is more unlikely to us than that, and that the witness of these people who saw Jesus alive for 40 years in the face of all kinds of persecution makes us believe that it is real and that Jesus is alive. Now, it's not just these 11 guys, right? There's other stories of Jesus appearing to people alive. He appeared to Mary Magdalene, who was one of his followers, and this is a cool story. And there's a lot here to think about, that Jesus appears to Mary in the garden. She doesn't recognize him right away. She's weeping. Her eyes are filled with tears, right? But when he speaks her name, she recognizes him. And Jesus tells her to go and tell the disciples that he's alive, that he's been raised from the dead, and that they should meet him in Galilee as he told them. There's some interesting things here, right? There are churches in the world who say that women shouldn't be pastors, that it's only for men to carry the good news of Jesus Christ, the resurrected Son of God. Who was the first person who carried a message of Jesus Christ, the resurrected Son of God? Mary Magdalene. And she carried it to the apostles, to these men that Jesus had chosen. In our church, we have female ordination. We have women pastors, in part because of the witness of Mary Magdalene, that when Jesus wanted the good news of his resurrection to be told, he went to a woman. He appeared to a woman and gave a woman this responsibility. So women clearly have this ability, and it's not something we think, it's something that we know from Jesus. So that's why, part of why we do what we do. Right? You can read about that in John chapter 20. There's a story in Luke about Jesus appearing to Cleopas and a companion, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's his wife, right, on the road to Emmaus, that these two are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and Jesus joins them on the road. They don't recognize him initially on the road, and they tell him about their sadness, about all that's been going on in Jerusalem, about Jesus' death, and this stranger, who's Jesus, explains to them why it had to happen, why the scriptures say that the Messiah had to die in this way. They invite him to stay with them for the night at their house, and as they're setting out food, Jesus breaks the bread, and in the breaking of the bread they recognize him, right? That they see the crucified marks on his hands. We don't know, and then he disappears from them. So there's all kinds of questions about this story, but they recognize him, they know him, and they're so excited that night has fallen. It's not safe on the roads, but they go back that night to Jerusalem, and they find the apostles, and they say, Jesus appeared to us, and the apostles say, well, yeah, he appeared to us too. We'll get to that in a minute, but that these people the road to Emmaus story is weird, because they don't recognize him, but then boom, their eyes are open, then they see him clearly, and when they share it with other people who absolutely recognize Jesus. So before we get to that, the apostles being visited by Jesus, we should give you some more words of the phrase that pays. 4 words this time. To the whole man. To the whole, W-H-O-L-E, man, right? So by the time Cleopas and the other person, the wife or friend, get to the apostles, Jesus has already appeared to the 10 of them, right? Thomas wasn't there, and Judas has done away with himself. But the 10 apostles were gathered in a locked room. They were very afraid of what would happen to them now that Jesus has been killed. They've heard this story from Mary Magdalene that Jesus is alive, but they think it's crazy because, as you're aware, people don't rise from the dead, right? And so they know that, right? And they're not fools. They know that people who are dead don't come back to life. So they're locked in this little room, and suddenly Jesus is standing in their midst. That not only can he disguise who he is, like we learned on the road to Emmaus, but he can move through locked doors. That his new body is like our bodies in some way, and very unlike our bodies in other ways, right? So he appears in their midst. He says, "Peace be to you." They are terrified, right? In one version, I think it's John's version, he asks if there's anything to eat, and he eats some broiled fish in front of them. And there are people in the world who say that little detail helps them believe, that ghosts don't eat broiled fish, and that it's just such an odd detail to put in that it just rings of truth. At any rate, Jesus appears to the 10. You can look it up in Mark and Luke and in John, and talks to them. They recognize him. And then, they know he's alive, right? And they're terrified and they're excited and the whole deal. They tell Thomas, we saw the Lord, and Thomas says, no, you didn't. Dead people don't come back to life. You guys are losers. Jesus is dead. You got to just accept that Jesus is dead. And they say, no, we saw him. He's back to life. And Thomas says, look, unless I stick my fingers in the holes in his hands, unless I stick my hand up into the hole in his side that the spear made, I'm not going to believe it. Dead people are dead. They stay dead. Jesus is dead. And the disciples say, no, he's alive. And Thomas says, listen, I've told you, until I can, do this, I'm not believing you. It's craziness. So a week after the first time, the next Sunday night, Thomas and the others are back in that room. They're still afraid. They're locked in there. And Jesus again comes through the locked doors, and he interacts with them again. And he says to Thomas, he wasn't there when Thomas made his big pronouncement. He says, okay, Thomas, here's my hands. Go ahead, touch my hands. Here's my side. Put your hand in my side. Do what you need to do. And Thomas doesn't need to do it. Thomas knows, right? And Thomas says to him, my Lord and my God, right? And worships him. That Thomas knows who Jesus is, and knows it in his bones, right? Who Jesus is. That Jesus really is alive. It's not a ghost. It's not a spirit. It's not someone pretending. That Jesus, still bearing the marks of the crucifixion, but having these additional powers, now is with them, is in their midst. A few weeks after that, Simon Peter and some of the others have gone fishing, right? They're up in Galilee. They fish all night. They haven't done very well. And a guy calls out to them from the beach, throw the net down the other side. They throw the net from the other side. Wham! The nets are filled with fish. They have trouble hauling them into the boat. There's so many fish. The boats are in danger of sinking. And John says to Peter, it's the Lord. And Peter jumps right into the water and swims to shore to see Jesus. Now the others, they bring the boats in. There's 153 fish in the boats. It's sort of an interesting number, 153. The Jews in Jesus' time believed that there were 153 nations in the world, 153 different kinds of people. And so what's probably going on here is that, that they are supposed to catch, they're supposed to reach, they're supposed to bring the good news to all of the different peoples in the world, all the 153 different kinds. We know that there are more nations and kinds than that, but that's what they thought, and so that's the number of fish that they brought in. Anyway, when they get to shore, it is Jesus. He's built a fire for them. He's cooked them breakfast, which is, I think we all agree, something ghosts can't do. He's made them breakfast, bread and broiled fish, and they eat and they talk, and they're afraid because they understand, like you do, that dead people aren't supposed to come back to life, so they don't really know what's going on still. And Jesus has this really weird conversation with Peter where he keeps asking Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yeah, I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. And then a little while later, Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know I love you. Tend my lambs. And then a little while later, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's really hurt. You know I do. Feed my sheep. The cool part there is, remember when Jesus was arrested and standing trial, Peter denied Jesus 3 times? Jesus gives Peter these 3 opportunities to walk it back. And then he not only gives him an opportunity to walk it back, he gives him something to do. that your life is supposed to be about taking care of my people, my little ones. And so, this is who Jesus is, young men, young women. That when you make mistakes, Jesus wants to restore you and to give you something to do, to make your life valuable, to make your life worthwhile. And that Jesus is not ever going to write you off. That doesn't happen. He didn't write Peter off when Peter denied him in his hour of greatest need. He came back and he restored Peter. He comes back, he restores you. It's a great story. You should read it. It's in John 21, and it ends with a prediction of Peter's death. I told you earlier that Peter dies crucified, and Jesus here says that Peter is going to die for his belief in Jesus, for his work on Jesus' behalf. And so, Jesus, his new body with expanded powers that we can't really contemplate, is an amazing thing for us to see and to watch in these stories. There's the next three words of the phrase that pays, right? Jesus and say. Jesus and say, S-A-Y. We know from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and it's just a few verses, you can just read them, that there's other appearances that Jesus makes that we don't know many details about, right? He apparently appeared to a crowd of 500 people, and so there was no question about there's just a few people keeping a little secret over here. Right, we agreed, I think, that you're not going to have 12 people keeping alive for 40 years. 500 people are not going to be able to keep alive. That there's a breadth of witnesses that see Jesus alive, that interact with him alive after he's been raised from the dead. He appears to Peter individually. We don't know many of those details. Right? And he appears to his brother James. His little brother James winds up taking over control of the church in Jerusalem and is the leader of the church after Jesus ascends into heaven. And so it would have been awfully good to get some of the details of those conversations, but we just don't know them. But Paul knows about them and just tells us that they happened. We talked in discussion group and confirmation last week about Jesus appearing to Paul. The Pharisee Saul was an opponent of the church, imprisoned Christians, killed Christians, was trying to save Judaism from what he thought was this infection of Christianity, this wicked heresy of Christianity. And Jesus appeared to Saul in a blinding light on the road to Damascus, knocked him off his horse, struck him blind, and then 3 days later sent Ananias to Paul, to give him his sight back. It's a good story, actually. Jesus appears to Ananias in a vision and says, Ananias, I want you to go and lay your hands on a guy named Saul and heal him. And Ananias says, I don't want to go. He came here to Damascus to arrest us, and I don't want to be arrested. Jesus says, he's been praying, and for 3 days he's been praying, and I've told him that a guy named Ananias is coming. So get over there and pray for him. So Ananias goes, puts his hands on Saul, prays for him. Something like scales fall from Saul's eyes, and he can see again. He immediately asks to be baptized, and he's baptized. He's now a follower of Jesus. He goes into Arabia for 3 years and studies the Old Testament and the Scriptures and the prophets to figure out who Jesus was and how it all hangs together. He comes back. He begins to teach and to preach. And so, whatever happened to Saul was so compelling that it changed his whole life. And he too endured imprisonments and beatings and floggings and stonings and ultimately death. And he would never waver from this idea that Jesus was not only alive, but that Jesus had appeared to him and had made him one of the apostles. So, we just have these wonderful stories of of Jesus not only, sort of drifting into a scene like a ghost, but Jesus with power and with vigor doing things that only someone with a body can do, building fires, cooking fish, making bread, that Jesus is alive, he's powerful, he can be touched, he can eat, that there's it's just a cool constellation of stories. After about 6 weeks, Jesus takes his disciples out to the Mount of Olives. He gives them what we call the Great Commission. Commission is something that you're supposed to do. It says, go into all the world, making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always to the end of the earth, right? So go out to the edge of the world, make disciples. How do you make a disciple? By baptizing them and teaching them everything that Jesus commanded. And Jesus promises to be with us always. And then he rises up into heaven. In some of the stories, angels appear and say, hey guys, what are you looking at? The guys are standing there with their mouths open, can't see Jesus anymore. And some angels say, what are you looking at? Go back to Jerusalem like he told you and wait for, what he told you to wait for. The next 3 words, the phrase that pays, that is God. That is God. So after the ascension, they do go back to Jerusalem, and they're waiting there. At this point in the history, there's about 120 people on the planet that are believers in Jesus. Maybe the 500 that he appeared to. Maybe some of them couldn't be there or were other places. Or there's 120 people ish gathered in a place on the Jewish day of Pentecost. It's a festival of Judaism that now is a festival of Christianity, right? So they're gathered on the day of Pentecost. Pentecost is 50. It's 50 days after the Passover, right? So they're gathered, and suddenly there's a sound in this room like a rushing wind, and little tongues of fire appear on the heads of all of these believers. I don't know how to understand that, except that's what the words are, right? And then they suddenly they're filled with the Holy Spirit, and they can speak languages that they never learned. So they spill out into the streets, and they're speaking languages that they've never learned to other people. And it's a cool thing, because at this Jewish festival of Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, Jerusalem is filled with pilgrims, Jews who've come from around the world, and they all hear the story of Jesus in their own languages from these 120 believers who are filled with the Holy Spirit. And they don't know what's going on, but they're all suddenly in their own languages. They're hearing these remarkable stories about Jesus, the Messiah, who's been raised from the dead. Peter gathers everyone's attention, and he preaches a sermon, right, about Jesus, about how God sent the Messiah, and our authorities killed him, but God didn't leave him dead. God raised him from the dead, and the people hearing this sermon are their consciences are struck. They want to know how to follow Jesus. Peter tells them, that they can be baptized and be followers of Jesus. And that day, 3,000 people became members of the Christian church, and we have been growing since then. So, there's just all kinds of stuff here to talk about. The speaking in languages that you never learned, being filled with the Holy Spirit and what that means. But now you have the in-between history from what happened on Good Friday when Jesus dies to what happens on Pentecost when the Holy Spirit's poured out. And now we're going to go into the part of this confirmation year where we talk about the what it means to live in this time where Jesus is alive and has ascended into heaven and is wanting us to go out into the whole world. So that's what we're going to be talking about. In your weekly readings, you're going to be reading more about this early stage of the church, about Paul's missionary journeys and different adventures in different places, and the persecutions that fell on the church. So for the next 6 weeks or so, you're going to be reading these stories. We're going to be having the opportunity to talk about those in discussion group 2. But those are the 2 tracks that we're on now for the next few weeks. After you finish those stories in your readings about the early church, you're going to read through the rest of of the New Testament, mostly letters from Paul to these churches that he's founding, and we're going to keep talking about the Catechism and how we live as followers of Christ now. So those will be those 2 tracks that'll take us to the end of the year, right? First the stories of the early church, and then the letters of Paul and the New Testament, and then all of us in the Catechism talking about how we're supposed to live. So that is lesson 3. You take care of yourself. Oh, the quote, of course, is from Martin Luther. They almost always are. But you should put that on the phrase, the pays too. And I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. You take care of yourself. Bye-bye.